Chapter 14. Downtime Part 2. Naruto sat down at his kitchen table and sprawled his sealing kit all around the scroll. He was anxious to get started. What really excited him was that he had no idea what to expect. The idea of taking a test, actually devised by his idol, was exhilarating. With bated breath, he opened the scroll and burned through the only visible section. Naruto groaned as he combed over the instructions. Sadly, it was a formal test. His gut turned as he gazed at the first paragraph, which read, "For this exam, you will be tested for your mastery of the intermediary level of Fuinjutsu. Should you pass this exam, you will be permitted to move forward to the advanced classes. This exam is split into 4 parts: a multiple choice, fill in the blank, a free response, and a puzzle still for you to solve. You will have 2 hours and 30 minutes from the moment you begin the exam. After the allotted time, security seals in the scroll will activate, preventing you from answering any further. If these seals are tampered with in any way, the scroll will lock and you will instantly fail. Any marks entered after the allotted time will not be counted. After the allotted time, you shall receive instant feedback for your grade. To begin the test, place your hand on the area below this paragraph and insert your chakra. This will act as your signature for grading later on. I am proud of all of you for getting this far, and I wish you the best of luck." Even though he knew the message wasn't directed at him, Naruto still felt his heart skip a beat from the encouragement. He wiped away a single tear that threatened to fall from his eye, and forced himself to concentrate. It was time to get serious. Picking up his brush, he placed his hand over the scroll and began pumping chakra into the paper. Immediately, the scroll's contents were revealed, and a timer began counting down at the top of the page. It was time to begin. It was about midday as Sasuke strolled along the canals of the village. He never really did liked having a lot of free time. Even though he had disliked being forced to sit through the monotony of the academy, he had hated their summer breaks even more. All it did was give him more time to think, and whenever he started thinking, his thoughts would inevitably return to his brother. So he would drown himself in training to block out his thoughts and feelings. He couldn't reflect on his past if he was too tired to think. However, now he couldn't even do that. He tugged at the uncomfortable bandages on his shoulder. The nurse had been kind and very thorough when she inspected his injury. She wanted him to pass her compliments to Hinata for how well she had treated him up until this point. The nurse had bathed his shoulder in a strange green chakra, and a few minutes later, the injury was completely healed. Of course, that didn't stop her from wrapping him up in bandages to ensure that the newly formed tissue didn't tear, something about it still being delicate. So now, he was left with nothing to do but simply walk and think. Desperately trying to avoid thoughts of his brother, he directed his train of thought to reflect on his last mission. All in all, he had to say that he was quite pleased with his overall performance. Sure, he hadn't been able to let loose too much, but he finally had a comparison for where he placed among the shinobi of other villages. For a fresh genin, he had done very well, but even that wasn't good enough. It would never be good enough compared to him. Catching himself again, he shook his head and directed his thoughts towards the conclusion of the mission. To call what they had done brutal would have been an understatement. The more empathetic part of him actually hoped that the stone Chunin did not feel the full effects of their combined attacks. The backwind of heat alone had actually left small blisters along his body. He could only imagine the full pain that the man had to endure. He was still shocked how well the two of them worked together. Though the blonde sometimes made his blood boil, Sasuke could not deny that the two of them had chemistry. Even from when they were little, the two of them were easily able to read each other's minds. He remembered a particular incident from when the two of them were about 6. Naruto, being the rambunctious prankster he was, had been placed in detention for covering one of the boys from a civilian family head to toe in glitter. Of course, the boy had it coming, for he had been pelting the blonde boy from 2 rows above with spitballs for the past week. This was an interesting occasion for Naruto, for he wasn't alone in his punishment. He was also sharing the detention with Sasuke, who sat 2 seats away from him. This was back before the Uchiha incident. His brother had hyped up the academy as this amazing place, but it honestly did nothing but bore him. The day before, Sasuke had decided to skip school in an attempt to follow his brother around the village. Needless to say, his mother and the teacher had not been pleased. So they both had to sit out recess and snack time, and they could only stare at the other children as they got to play outside. Not that it mattered to Naruto, since no one ever wanted to play with him. Their stomachs grumbled as the two boys jealously glared at their classmates. Their teacher was sitting at his desk filling out some paperwork, when one of his colleagues poked his head in. The man had given the two a short glare, promising a world of pain if they moved. He took his bento box and placed it up in the highest cubby before walking out of the door. As soon as they heard their footsteps disappear, the two sprung up as one and moved to the cubbies. Without a word, Sasuke crossed his hands and gave Naruto a boost as he desperately tried to reach for their teacher's box. Naruto stretched his tiny fingers until he finally grasped the side of the container. His face lit up into his iconic smile as he clambered down and the boys rummaged through the box. When the teacher returned, he was happy to find the two boys sitting upright in their seats as if they hadn't moved. He grabbed his bento box and was about to get back to work. He reached for the dongo sticks he had been saving, but was surprised when he found them absent. He glared at the two boys, who desperately tried to hide their guilt, but they couldn't remove the crumbs that littered the sides of their mouths. The two of them worked in tandem a little too well for how much they, at times, despised one another. It was like they had some unspoken connection of long past that enabled them to act in tandem without thinking. It was something that always bothered him about the blonde. No matter how much he sometimes pushed him away, they seemed to be linked together. As his thoughts returned to the battle, an offhand comment from the stone shinobi made him pause. "Stop getting in my way, Uchiha! You can't stop me from getting the Yoindaime brat!" What had he meant by that exactly? Sure, Naruto had Fuinjutsu in common with the 4th Hokage, but he wouldn't call that enough to label him that way. This thought made him stop. Actually, how did the stone shinobi even know he was good at Fuinjutsu? Maybe he started chasing them back towards Hinata's fight. Naruto had not even demonstrated that he was good with seals. Had they been spying on them? Maybe, but certainly not that man, he reasoned. The metal man had seized up and charged the blonde the instant he saw him. If he had been the one spying on him before, he would have jumped him then. What was it about Naruto that screamed a connection between him and the Yoindaime? Sasuke stopped along the river and gazed up at the looming stone head of the man in question. He could kind of see a resemblance. They both certainly had the spiky hair. From the few pictures he had seen of the man, he guessed they had similar hair color. Those were a few connections, but Sasuke scoffed as he thought at the more abundant differences. While he was sure some details were embellished, he reflected on how the villagers would describe their fallen hero. A man who was a genius above all others but never flaunted it, extremely humble and patient, and a man who always kept a level head. Crap, 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 crap! Naruto muttered as he glanced at the clock. Sasuke scoffed as he thought of his teammate. The blonde was clever, but he was about as impatient as they come. So what could... Hey, what are you doing down there? Sasuke was cut out of his musings and looked up to see a young girl staring down at him. She seemed to be around his age. He didn't recognize her from the academy, so he assumed she was a civilian. She had long black hair and black eyes that mirrored his own, except hers held a different emotion. She was carrying a bag of groceries in her hands and held a distinct look of irritation as she glared at him. "You heard me, Baka. What are you doing down there? The adults here don't want us walking next to the water." Sasuke scoffed and glared back at her. "Trust me, I'm fine. I'm the last person you need to worry about getting hurt." "Says the guy with his arm bandaged up," she shot back. "And who said I was worried about you getting hurt?" He clenched his teeth as he rebutted. "You seem to worry enough about me falling in." "It's not about falling in, dummy. It's about the water moccasins that inhabit the area, like the one you're about to step on." Sure enough, Sasuke looked down and uncharacteristically let out a yelp as he jumped back from the black and yellow snake that sat coiled in front of him. She had giggled for a second behind her eyes, slightly widened as he flipped several feet in the air and landed close to her. "So you're a shinobi. So what if I am?" he asked, noticing the disdain in her voice. Nothing. She seemed to shrug. So much for the ever-vigilant shinobi who are supposed to protect us. You guys can't even protect yourselves. Sasuke wanted to protest, but she did have him stuck here. It would have been disastrous if he had stepped on the serpent. If it had bitten him, he didn't know if he would have been able to make it back to the hospital in time. So he grit his teeth and mumbled something under his breath. Didn't quite catch that. I said, "A little louder, duck butt." He sent her a glare as he clenched out, "Thank you." She sent him a smirk. "Don't mention it." "Well, I have to go, ninja boy. In case you didn't know, the world doesn't always revolve around you guys. I have a brother to feed. The name's Ria, by the way. What's yours, duck butt?" He ignored her comment about his hair as he said, "Sasuke." "Pleasure. Well, goodbye, Sasuke. Try to keep yourself out of trouble." With that, she turned around as she started to continue her way up the river as if they had never talked. Sasuke glared at her retreating form for a while before he turned his attention back to the black snake, which seemed to be staring right at him. It hissed at him, and he responded by using his good arm to chuck a kunai at it. It moved its head just out of the way before turning and heading into the water. Snakes always gave Sasuke chills. With one last glance before it dived back into the water, Sasuke tucked his hands in his pocket and began walking into the village. It was getting around time to grab dinner. Naruto was sweating. He desperately tried to shut out each tick of the clock that counted down to his deadline. Crap! Everything had started out well enough. He had flashed through the first parts of the exam without a problem, no pun intended, but now he was surprised that he was actually being challenged by the puzzle seal. A required trait for all Fuinjutsu users was being able to discern the hidden code within each individual or set of kanji. Some seals operated on specific letters alone, while others required multiple letters to work in conjunction. Some even required lines of kanji that stretched out for several feet to achieve their intended purpose. Of course, this was very impractical for several cases. So a method was developed to reduce the size of these segments. Sprawling branches of kanji could be compared in the smaller and more manageable shapes and sizes. It was like condensing a paragraph into a single word or two. In fact, that had been one of the problems he had faced as he was unraveling the Hiraishin. Before he had been introduced to the idea, he had struggled to understand that the symbols of endurance, love, and sword each held their own sprawling library of code. Back to his test, revealing these branches wasn't the issue. Reading the dang thing was what truly plagued him. Naruto was struggling with the puzzle that was constantly contorting and shifting across the page. The ink seemed to have a life of its own as it sprung across the page and shifted into a variety of shapes. Whenever Naruto tried to enlarge a specific line of the seal's formula, it would be covered or contorted so that he could not read it. The fourth Hokage must have been a real sadistic dick if he thought this was funny. He was fighting against the clock now, and he knew it. When the seal had started shifting, he had panicked and had been unable to regain his composure. As time continued to run out, he only panicked even harder. He had no idea what the seal did, let alone what he was supposed to do. There were no instructions when he reached this part. All there had been was a large black circle of ink that morphed into a decagon upon his touch. Each angle spat out a different line of code and began spinning clockwise. When he reached out the touch one, it branched out into numerous links that contorted into unreadable squiggles. It made his head spin. What was the fourth Hokage expecting him to do? He closed his eyes and clutched his face. This wasn't working. He needed to try something else. He was going to fail otherwise. He needed... A strange calm washed over him as a word of advice seemed to creep into his mind. Whenever you find yourself facing a problem and under great stress, take a moment to step away. Take a deep breath and look at the problem a different way. Naruto let out a deep breath and closed his eyes. He finally started to slow down as he began to slowly inhale and exhale. I can do this. I just need to be calm. As his heartbeat settled down, his mind retraced his steps to the beginning. When he had reached this section, he had immediately pounced on the large blob in the center. It was at the forefront and designed to grab your attention. If activated, it would intentionally spiral out and try to confuse the reader. There was no way the 4th Hokage actually expected them to be able to read through this hot mess. It just wasn't possible. There had to be something else. He let out the breath he'd been holding and slammed his hands onto the scroll. He clenched his fingers as he twisted his hands counterclockwise. Immediately, the scroll began spinning in the opposite direction and began curling back into its original shape, until the singular black circle returned to the page. Naruto leaned back as he studied the blot. He let his eyes wander the page, soaking in every detail until he noticed 4 black dots until the edge of the paper. Each of them was about the size of the tip of a pencil. He had totally missed them during his first attempt, and then it hit him. It was a message that had been drilled into his head by every book he had ever read about Fuinjutsu. Whenever faced with a new seal, always take your time to study it by parts and always work from the outside in. He pressed his fingers on the top 2 dots and spread them across the page, revealing a new line of code that did not twist like the others before it. He did the same to the bottom 2 and made a square made of kanji around the circle. He slowly read over the instructions and slapped himself in the head. It was so simple. Picking up his brush, he reactivated the circle, causing the branches to spread across the page, leaving an empty space right in the middle of the page. This time, the branches did not wiggle or contort on the paper. Instead, they drew straight lines to the corners of the square. Every branch contained the same question repeated over and over again. Smiling, he began writing his response in the center of the paper. The timer ticked down its final seconds as he finished his final stroke. It asked, "What is most important when tackling a new problem?" Naruto chuckled as he formed the hand signs to lace the kanji with chakra. He really had to thank Kitsune for his advice. In the middle of the page were only 2 kanji, which read, "Patience." The scroll glowed bright red as the timer stopped at 0. A second later, the whole scroll glowed white and Naruto could no longer see the page. A green light began descending from the tip of the scroll all the way towards the end. When it reached the bottom, the glowing light vanished, revealing green check marks next to all of his answers. He chuckled as he stared at a small lollipop that had appeared at the top of the next page to his grade. He picked it up and rolled it around his hands before opening the wrapper. Time flowed differently for things in seals. It could be designed to be dramatically faster, but usually time crept almost to a halt inside of seals. The piece of candy had been sitting there for who knows how many years, but it was probably in the same condition the 4th Hokage bought it in. Naruto popped the candy in his mouth and couldn't suppress the warm feeling of giddiness that spread across his chest. He had passed with flying colors. The next few days seemed to fly by, and before they knew it, the members of Team 7 found themselves walking together towards their training grounds. Naruto had been sure to boast that he had officially moved on to the advanced Fuinjutsu material. Hinata happily applauded his accomplishment, while Sasuke simply told him, "Good job." They were shocked when they found their sensei leaning against the side of the bridge with his book suspiciously absent. You're actually on time," Naruto stuttered. "Yes, I suppose I am." He sighed as he gazed over the 3 of them. "What's going on, sensei?" Hinata asked cautiously. He sighed as he gazed over the 3 of them. "I would like to offer you all an apology." He could literally see the confusion etch on their faces. "I will admit that my behavior has been a little lax when it comes to your training, and for that, I apologize. Despite that, you 3 were able to overcome a major obstacle all on your own, and for that, you should be commended." They were quickly cut off from smiling when he said, "Don't let that get to your head. In fact, even though you repelled those Chunin, you all would be dead if I hadn't shown the deal with the Jonin leader. Whether I like it or not, you 3 are going to be facing some big challenges in your futures, and you will need to be ready for them. So I had a conversation with the Hokage." They each stared at him curiously. "For the next month, you 3 are mine. We will not be going on any missions for the time being. Naruto began cheering and jumping up and down before Kakashi cut him off. This does not mean things are going to be easy for you. In case you didn't know, I was the captain of Ambu for a reason. For the next month, I'm going to train you until your knuckles bleed, your insides will burn, and you will feel as if you're going to collapse. You do what I tell you to do, and only leave when I tell you to leave. If you manage to succeed in the goals I put out for you, the Hokage will assign us several C-rank missions to make up for the D ranks we will have missed. And with that, that is all. Sasuke had been shocked. This is exactly what he had hoped for. But apparently, there was more? In case you didn't know, the Chunin exams are coming up relatively soon. If we are to do this, the Hokage doesn't just expect you three to enter. He expects you to pass. He is breaking protocol here by allowing us to do this, so he expects results. Now are you three up to it? Sasuke grinned as he looked between his teammates. Naruto shared his grin, and Hinata had a look of grim determination. Do you even need to ask? Naruto asked. Good. Now then. Kakashi rushed forward faster than it could blink and drove his fist into Naruto's gut. His eyes bulged out of his head as he was flung several feet away. Kakashi stared down at the faces of his shocked students and said, "Training begins now." Chapter 15. Gluttons for Pain. Sasuke could only blink before Kakashi backhanded him. The metal plates of his gloves caused blood to spill from Sasuke's nose. He backed away, gasping in pain, as Sorry, guys. As Kakashi... Oh, nice. As Kakashi whipped a kick at Hinata, having more time than her teammates, she was able to duck under the blow. Veins bulged around her eyes as she leapt towards the man with her hands bathed in blue chakra. She was shocked when he caught her wrists and spun her in a circle, before flinging her into her blonde teammate who was still struggling to get up. They crashed into each other with a satisfying thud, and Kakashi rounded on Sasuke, who was still clutching his nose. Sasuke opened one clenched eye to see a fist rocketing towards his face. All he could do was brace himself as the punch sent him flying back. Dirt was torn up as he rolled away from the Jonin. Sasuke clutched his aching face in his hands as he angrily glared at his sensei. Hinata was holding her hip as she tried to help up her teammate, who was trying to regain his breath. Like I told you, for the next month, I'm going to drag you all through hell and back. If you manage to survive, you might learn a thing or two. Now, come at me. Hinata was shivering. Gone was the jovial Kakashi that they had grown to know during training. This was the stone-cold assassin she had glimpsed when he drove his hand through the Jonin's chest. Naruto was finally able to stand on his own and was glaring daggers at their sensei. He was gonna get it for that cheap shot. He and Sasuke shared a glance and raced towards the man. It was a storm of fists and kicks as they assaulted him. One attack from below, as the other would move in at the man's chest. He barely seemed to move as the two other genin bounced around the man. No matter what they did, there was an arm or knee to block their attacks. All of his moves were precise, thought out, and delivered with the power of a piston. Kakashi blocked simultaneous kicks from the boys on both sides as he felt a slight presence behind him. He grabbed Naruto's leg and swung him into Sasuke before diving out of the way of Hinata's strike. The two were sent flying away as Hinata engaged the man. She was growing more and more frustrated as he just seemed to dance out of the way of all her strikes. With her Byakugan, she could see Sasuke push the blonde off him and began to form his chakra. She continued a few strikes before replacing herself with a block of wood as he screamed, "Fire style! Fireball jutsu!" A raging ball of fire raced towards the Jonin, engulfing the spot he had occupied. Sasuke stared at the burning fire for a second before scanning the surrounding tree line. Where did he... Kakashi appeared out of nowhere and delivered a roundhouse kick to the boy's side. As Sasuke tumbled out of the way, Kakashi noticed a shadow growing beneath him and heard Naruto scream as he fell from above with a kunai in hand. Without looking, he threw a kunai of his own at the clone faster than it could see, causing it to disappear in a puff of smoke. Without breaking a sweat, Kakashi plunged his hand into the earth below him and yanked up a sputtering Naruto by the throat. Never pull the same trick on an opponent you have already faced. Kakashi chided as he tightened his grip. Yeah, I know, he tried to sputter. There was a loud pop as the kunai the destroyed clone had been holding transformed and raced towards Kakashi with a piece of paper in his hand. In the blink of an eye, Kakashi swiped the paper out of the clone's hand, smacked it onto the original's forehead, and proceeded to drive a kunai through the skull of the shocked clone. Kakashi relinquished his grasp of Naruto and raised one hand in a seal. He quietly murmured, "Activate," causing the real Naruto to plummet into the ground, leaving a small crater. Ugh, dang it, he muttered through clenched teeth as he struggled to move. Remember not to let your opponents use your own moves against you. Kakashi whipped around and grabbed the wrist of his female student, who'd been silently creeping up on him. He continued her forward motion and directed her hand toward the ground. He plunged her glowing hand into the thigh of her blonde teammate, who cried out in pain as his thigh started cramping and his tenketsu was forcibly closed. "Naru!" She began to scream, but was caught off as Kakashi wrapped her arm uncontrollably behind her back. She gasped in pain as he tightened his grip. The same goes for you too, Hinata. Be wary of taijutsu users who will aim to redirect your attacks. Hinata winced from his grip and tried to turn her head to face the man. She stopped when she saw something that made her eyes widen. Instantly, the veins receded from her face and she squeezed her eyes shut. A second later, a kunai harmlessly sailed over her head right in front of the Jonin's face. He was about to glance at it, but noticed a small ball tied to the handle just in time. Flashbang. Kakashi thought before it lit up. He let go of Hinata as Sasuke raced towards him to take advantage of his momentary blindness. Good. They know not to let up. Each one has been attacking me, one after the other, in an attempt to capitalize on my divided attention. They know they are outmatched, so they are resorting to try to trick me when I'm distracted. Even with his vision impaired, Kakashi and Sasuke began a one-sided taijutsu bout as Hinata stumbled up to Naruto. Her eyes had been closed shut, but that flashbang had still gone off very close to her. She rubbed her eyes as she tried to talk to her crush. Naruto, how do I undo the gravity seal? He grunted as he tried to turn his head to her. Normally, you just form the release sign, but mine are more complicated than that. I designed them so only my chakra could release them. Either I need to form the release sign, or I need to force my chakra through the seal. You could try to rip it off, but I'd like to keep the skin on my face. Right now, I'm so weighed down, I can't move my arms. She shook off the blush that threatened to spread across her face as she reached out for his hands. If she could get his fingers into the proper hand sign, he could release the seal. She lightly tugged on his arms, but was now pulling as hard as she could to lift his hand. It wouldn't budge. How strong did you make this thing? About 6 times Earth's gravity, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Alright, she needed a new plan. Hinata once again activated her Byakugan and knelt beside him. She placed 2 fingers along his neck just above his heart. What are you doing? I'm trying to direct the flow of chakra from your heart to your forehead by nudging it along with my own chakra. Please be quiet. I need to focus on carefully maneuvering the chakra out of your aorta and through your chakra system. If I move too much, my chakra might cut into your veins. Focus on the area under the seal and prepare for my signal. Even through his stiff pain, he was surprised. This was the Hinata he knew, when she went into what he called her doctor mode. Gone was the shy and timid girl, and in came the composed, no-nonsense semi-professional. She began gently tracing her fingers up his back as she directed the flow of his chakra. Despite the dire situation they were in, he was getting ticklish and tried his best not to squirm. It was odd to say the least, as she ran her fingers up and down his neck following the chakra flow, and he couldn't help but blush from her touch. She traced her delicate fingers up his neck and along his cheek until she finally said, "Now." He was blushing up a storm as he squinted his eyes and forced his chakra into the tag. The paper glowed blue before it peeled off his face and fluttered to the ground. "Thank you." He stuttered as he tried to get up. He gasped in pain and collapsed as he held his leg. "Would you mind?" "Of course." She smiled as she lightly jabbed the tenketsu in his leg. The built-up pressure dissipated as her foreign chakra was removed from his system. They began to smile at one another as Sasuke landed right next to them in front of them. "Sasuke!" "Dang it!" They each grabbed an arm and started to help the panting boy to his feet. He was covered in scratches and marks, and could tell they would form into nasty bruises. They all began to glare at their sensei, who was casually strolling up to them. "This is just the warm-up, my adorable little genin. For the next month, I am going to be beating you all into the ground, so you better get used to this. Come now, no need for frowns. Guess what? Considering what I have in store, Hinata will soon be able to patch you all up in no time. We'll have our own little medic who can heal you up, just as we can start all over again. Doesn't that sound fun?" The genin were trembling as their doom slowly marched towards them. They couldn't tell if his smile was genuine or not. Was he doing it to mess with them? Or did he really get a kick out of this? He leaned over them and said, "Let's get to work." 2 training fields over, Team 8 was having a much more tranquil training session. Kiba and Shino were sitting in the shade as Akamaru cheered on Sakura, who was sparring with Kurenai. She was breathing pretty hard with heavy pants and her whole body was drenched in sweat, but she pushed her exhaustion to the side as she lunged at the older woman. The fresh jonin simply weaved out of the way of her punches and landed light taps along her body. Finally, she held up a hand and said, "Stop. That is enough for now." Sakura had her hands on her knees as she smiled up at her role model. "You have come a long way, Sakura. I'm very proud of your improvement." "Thank you, sensei." The younger girl beamed. Kurenai couldn't have been more proud as she stared down at her pupil. There had been some problems early on, but she had made sure to stamp those out quickly. The girl was fiercely intelligent and had the most superb chakra control she had ever seen in a genin. While this was due to her smaller than average chakra reserves, it was far easier to increase one's reserves than mastering control. The girl had simply flourished under the direction of a female mentor. In a world of predominantly male shinobi, it was rare to find a female role model amongst the ranks of their forces. There were always the tales of the legendary Tsunade, but stories could only go so far. Some people needed that role model in their life to guide them along their path of becoming a better person. Kurenai was more than a little humbled when the girl had shown up in a similar attire to hers. Instead of her red sleeve, it was pink to match her hair. It was like getting to train her own little protege, but not quite to the extent that Guy had gone with his student. Sakura had burned through the genjutsu material Kurenai had set out for her in a heartbeat, and was already moving on to develop her own. Sakura was her pride and joy, but that didn't mean she wasn't also proud of her other students as well. Kiba's skill in taijutsu was nothing to laugh at, but that was not really the main reason she was proud of him. Kiba could be rash and hot-headed, but his personality is what brought the team together. His partner techniques and pack mentality really helped unify the 3 of them. Of course, Sakura was always there to keep him in line whenever he went too far. A quick bop in the head and he was whimpering like a dog with his tails in between his legs. Shino, on the other hand, was quiet and calculative. He would mostly stay out of most of their conversations and only chime in to propose an outside view of the situation. His analytical mind helped rein in Kiba's impulsiveness and gain points of Sakura. She had originally been put off by the bug user's techniques, but that had been stamped away after her long talk with Kurenai regarding her future as a kunoichi. That was her purpose, the middle ground. She could sometimes be as hot-headed and passionate as Kiba, but also able to take a step back and look at a situation calmly like Shino. Kurenai smiled as she looked over at the boys. "You better look out, Kiba. Pretty soon she'll be dropping you in an all-out spar." "Yeah, right," Kiba scoffed, as if she could actually lay a scratch on me. "I don't care how much better she's gotten. No little girl..." He felt a large amount of killing intent and yelped as he stared at the dark figure looming above him. A dark silhouette of his teammate stared down at him. "Oh? What's wrong with being a girl?" the dark figure boomed as it cracked its knuckles. Nothing, Sakura. I just meant..." "Oh, I know what you meant. I'm just not very happy about it." Come on, Sakura," he stuttered as he backed into a tree. "Is all this genjutsu really necessary?" The dark figure loomed above him with glowing yellow eyes. Pink hair cascaded and whipped around her as a white smile lit up her face. "Yes, I think it is. Really brings out the fear in your eyes. Besides, all you're seeing is what you think of me. Are you saying you're really afraid of some helpless little girl?" Kiba whimpered as he braced himself for the impending beatdown. Shino shook his head as he watched the antics of his teammates. Kiba just couldn't keep his big mouth shut. You would think being on a team with a female Jonin would beat out that kind of mindset. It still impressed him how Sakura seemed to be able to create genjutsu without even realizing it. Kurenai found out one day as Sakura went off on Kiba for something stupid he did. She was glaring at him while flames seemed to flare up behind her and a dark figure loomed over her head. Kurenai had been surprised until Shino told her she had been doing this for years. Her class had just grown accustomed to it, unless it was directed at them. Kurenai's eyes had been as wide as stars as she excitedly raced up to the girl. It was fantastic. To create genjutsu without needing hand signs or even on purpose created so many possibilities. Kurenai massaged her forehead as she listened to Kiba's cries of pains. He just couldn't keep a lid on it. "I don't think he's ever going to learn," she said as she turned to Shino. "Probably not. If he was going to change, he probably would have learned after the third beating." She sighed as they stared at their antics. All in all, she was very pleased with their progress. They had even gone off on their first C-rank mission. They had gone to an outpost to pick up some reports when they had stumbled across a whole encampment of bandits. They had responded perfectly, and they were able to subdue the bandits without a scratch. However, this was nothing compared to what the other rookie teams had gotten into. Although she had originally been impressed by Asuma's story of the missing sand ninja, Kakashi's story blew theirs out of the water. Of course, it would be Team 7 to turn a D rank into an A rank. Well, it was only an A rank due to the presence of the Jonin. Even so, Kakashi's kids had been remarkable, dealing with 2 stone Chunin all by themselves. Their accomplishments made her excited. Maybe it was a little immature, but the 3 Jonin were very competitive, and she wanted to see how well her kids stacked up against the other teams. She would have the perfect chance too. If they kept progressing the way they had, she was confident they would be ready for the Chunin exams. Kiba would need to work on his impulsiveness, but she was pretty confident in Shino and Sakura's abilities. She knew Asuma, and he was probably just as lax in teaching as Kakashi was. She couldn't help but feel a little smug if they were able to wipe the floor with their old classmates. It would certainly make her feel smug to wipe the grin off of Anko's face. While she was her best friend, she could be a bit overwhelming at times. For whatever reason, she was rooting for Kakashi's group of kids over hers. Just because she was sleeping with the guy didn't mean she had to side with him on everything. She had been adamant that they could, in her own words, curb stomp your little maggots into oblivion. This only motivated Kurenai further to make sure her kids went above and beyond Kakashi's students. She knew the man, and there was no way he was pushing them any harder than he had to. "Again," Kakashi ordered. All 3 were panting as they stared up at the trees in front of them. They took a deep breath, and all 3 of them rushed up the side of the tree. Sasuke and Naruto were able to make it up about 8 or 9 steps before they lost control. Hinata once again made it all the way up the tree and ran back down. She had already been taught this exercise years ago to help bolster her chakra control. The Gyuken was a style that required expert control of one's chakra, and young Hyuga were drilled with these exercises from the moment they began training. The two boys grunted as they landed on their feet, while Hinata ran down the tree. Kakashi gave them a moment to catch their breath as he stared at them. Hinata had this down. He was just now making her do this to increase her reserves. Based on the technique she had created, she would need a much larger chakra system in order to cope with their drawbacks. After that initial beatdown, he decided to take it a little more slowly. He was going to ease them into his planned schedule. But that initial spar would serve to show that he could change their pace at any time. Very good, Hinata. You'll be moving on to the next step as these two keep working on this. Both of the boys were frustrated as they glared up at the trees. They had yet to find the right balance, and it was continuously throwing them off. With every failed attempt, they would just grow angrier, causing them to fall over and over. Yes, sensei, Hinata panted. What is the next step? I'll demonstrate. You two, pay attention for this. After you're done here, you will be moving on to this as well. Kakashi began going through hand signs before slamming his hands into the ground. Earth style, moving earth core. A square in the dirt formed in front of him, and it began to sink into the ground. He kept the jutsu going until there was about a 40 square foot hole in front. The others stared at the cube in the ground as Kakashi began running through more seals. Water style, waterfall cascade. A large stream of water erupted from his mask and began to fill the hole. As the water level became even with the ground, he cut off the jutsu. This is the next step, he calmly said as he strolled out onto the surface of the water. They could only stare in awe as their sensei shattered their view of the world. When he turned back to them, he couldn't help but chuckle. Oh, they were just so precious. After you master tree walking, you can move on to water walking. I will go into detail of the technique with you boys after you've completed the first step, he said as he rejoined them at the pond's edge. For now, you keep going at it until you have it mastered. You will not be moving on until I see fit. Now get back to it. Newly invigorated, the two boys raced off towards the tree as they tried their next attempt. Hinata, Kakashi called, drawing her attention away from the boys. I don't expect this to be too much trouble for you, but I expect you to apply yourself just as hard as they are. Yes, sir. Now, before we get started, I know you like your jacket and it's pretty heavy, but I don't think we need to give the boys any more ideas than necessary. Hinata was burning as red as a tomato, and Kakashi could swear he saw steam coming out of her ears. Kakashi-sensei! She whined as she tried to hide away into her jacket. He chuckled as he patted her head. I'm only teasing, but it wouldn't hurt to bring a towel to training either. She nodded her head as Naruto rang out, Hey, how come you're being so nice to her? Because she's actually doing a good job. Besides, Hinata's my favorite. Kakashi eye-smiled at the boy. Her face actually seemed to glow as she tried to bury herself deeper into her jacket. You're just saying that to be mean, Kakashi-sensei. Ass. Naruto pouted as a shuriken sailed next to his face. Language, Naruto. In fact, there was a reason Kakashi was going lighter on the girl. It was not because she was weaker. Well, not physically anyway. From what he had heard, negative reinforcement was not going to work on her as it might her teammates. They thrived in the face of a challenge. If the boys were told they couldn't do something, they would throw themselves at it until they had either accomplished it or they died trying. Her own clan had pushed her down for so many years, and all that did was drive her into her shell. She needed to be handled carefully. She needed to be handled carefully. He couldn't let up on her too much, but she had to know that he thought she was doing a good job. A little praise could go a long way for someone deprived of it. Too much pressure, and he could just make matters worse. Now, are you ready to get started? Yes, sir. She nodded as her face calmed down. Now the trick is to change the flow of your chakra with the flow of the water. Sasuke growled as he made another mark on the tree. This latest attempt was even further than his last. He just couldn't get it. He glared daggers at the tree as he landed on his feet. What was it he was doing wrong? He could understand why Hinata could do it, but why was he having such a hard time? The dope had been slowly creeping up on him and had passed his further point a while ago. He wasn't that far ahead, but it still irritated him to be overtaken by the blonde idiot. He sighed as he sat down to catch his breath. He shot a glare at Kakashi, who was off to the side working on a scroll. His orange book had been suspiciously absent, and it was strange to see him without his nose buried in pages of smut. He was apparently writing out his plans for them over the next few weeks. Naruto landed with a thud next to him and immediately fell on his back. He was panting heavily and frowned as he stared up at the tree. He was getting better, but he still felt like he was doing something wrong. He groaned as he sat up and stared out at the water. Hinata was standing in the middle of the pond with her eyes closed in deep concentration. Learning to stand on the water had been the easy part. Keeping her concentration and while moving forward was what eluded her grasp. He blushed when he realized her jacket had been tossed to the side long ago, for it was soaked and weighing her down. She stood in her mesh jacket as water dripped down her face from her hair due to her last attempt. It had been a long time since he had seen her without a jacket, and he had forgotten how slender she was. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath to clear her mind. She stretched her senses out and let her chakra mingle with the water. Though it appeared calm, she could feel the tiny ripples of its movements as it bounced against the shore. She let it up, and down movement flowed over her as she tentatively took a step forward. She maintained the rhythm of the water in her mind as she brought her foot down. There was a slight dip, but she adjusted her footing and took another step. Then another, and another. She was wobbling her way across the water and smiled. She was starting to get it. She opened her eyes to see the two boys staring at her, and a blush began creeping up her face. This tiny distraction was all that was needed to break her concentration as she fell into the cold water. She shivered as she swam up to the shore and pulled herself out of the water. She desperately tried to avoid eye contact with the boys. Both were blushing as they tried to ignore her, wiping herself off with her jacket. Boys, eyes front and center. Kakashi called out. Hinata, very good job. Within a day or two, I'm sure you'll have it down. Take a break for now. The two boys' heads turned around so fast, she was worried they were going to have whiplash. She blushed and called out, "Thank you," as she approached them and sat in the middle. "Sasuke, is your nose feeling better?" she asked. "Still hurts, but thank you for writing it." Kakashi backhanding him earlier had nearly broken his nose. Kakashi felt a little bad for that. He made sure it wasn't fully broken after they had their one-on-one bout, while Hinata helped Naruto out of his own seal. How are you two doing?" "Not as well as you," Naruto mumbled. "I just can't seem to get it. Every time I fail, I just get more frustrated." Although Sasuke remained silent, his thoughts were the same as Naruto. "Well, maybe that's the problem." They both stared at her as she got up and headed to the tree. What I was told to do was empty your mind as you attempt it. If you're upset or your mind is clouded, it can disrupt your chakra flow, causing you to fall." "Why is that?" Naruto asked as his face scrunched up. "Because chakra isn't just some neutral energy force. It responds to our emotions. If we are angry or upset, chakra takes on these characteristics. It will flow wildly and leak from your system. This is what makes it harder to control. If you're calm, it will flow smoothly like water, making it much easier." Naruto smiled as he jumped to his feet. "All right, let's try it." He closed his eyes and began taking deep breaths. He stopped smiling, and she noticed he was going into the same frame of mind he went into when he was working on seals. He pushed away his thoughts of irritation and instead focused on the basic kanji for fuinjutsu. Let go of your anger. Let go of your tension. His eyes snapped open and he raced towards the tree. As he raced up, his heart pounded as he neared his previous record, and he was delighted as he flew past it and kept going. He went about 8 more steps and started getting excited before he began to overload the chakra in his feet and he slipped from the bark. He slashed the tree as he fell back towards the ground. This landed with a thud and slipped onto his back. Although it had hurt, he was ecstatic. Her advice had worked. As Hinata raced over to check if he was alright, he enveloped her in a big hug and started spinning her around. He seemed to have no problem as the drenched girl soaked his clothes. Thank you! You're the best, Hinata! Her eyes rolled into the back of her head as she became limp in his grasp. Sasuke stared at them as he fumed over her comments. Of course, it was so simple. It infuriated him that he hadn't thought of it before. The same train of thought applied to anything. The angrier you were, the harder it was to concentrate. The more analytical side of his mind was intrigued that it would apply to chakra as well. As he thought this over, a new thought burst into his head. Is that why he said that? Was that his goal? He was instantly transported back to that night as his brother stood of the fresh corpses of his mother and father. That night was forever burned into his memory. His brother had made sure of that. If you want to kill me, curse me, hate me, and live a long, unsightly life. Was that why he had done it? So when they had their inevitable face-off, Sasuke would be so blinded by rage that his chakra and mind would be off balance. Had he really thought that far ahead? He clenched his fist as he stared up at the tree. I will not let my brother control my destiny anymore. He took a deep breath and thought of clouds to calm himself. His eyes shot open and he raced towards the tree full tilt. He soared past his previous marks and made several steps before the image of his brother's face came back into his mind. His concentration shattered and his chakra slipped from the tree trunk. He began falling and slammed his kunai into the bark to slow his descent. He jumped off and rolled to his feet before he stared at the tree. He had certainly surpassed his previous record, but it was nowhere good enough. So, they are finally starting to get it, Kakashi mused. His teammates offered their words of encouragement, but Sasuke ignored him as he faced his latest problems. This was something that would directly affect his final battle with his brother, and could potentially save him on the road to reach him. He needed to find a way to calm himself. As he thought this over, a new problem surprised him. What put him at ease? What were things that he actually liked to do?